The wind came first, not a whispering breeze or soft prelude to snowfall, but a sharp guttural roar that clawed at the corners of Evelyn Grace Dawson's cabin. It keened through every knot in the old timber like sorrow given breath. She sat by the hearth, hunched over a chipped mug of boiled bark water, no tea, no honey, no comfort. Just the bitter taste of endurance. Outside, the world had vanished under white. The drifts had swallowed her fence posts whole, erased the trail to the creek, even bowed the barn roof like a man dropping to his knees. In that stillness, it seemed the earth had stopped breathing. Sometimes Evelyn imagined it had, and some nights she wished it would take her with it. Once upon another life, she'd loved storms, back when her husband Sam was alive, and they'd bolt the shutters together, racing the weather, laughing breathlessly between gusts. Back when their infant son cooed between them under wool blankets, his tiny body warm against her chest. That laughter had long since gone quiet. Fever took the child. A winter later, Sam followed silent as falling ash. Afterward came the townsfolk with their sideways glances, their holy pity and sharp mouths. They buried her in whispers long before she chose solitude. Now she wore grief like a second skin. On Christmas she still pulled out the ivory dress she'd married Sam in, though it now hung from her frame like surrender. On ordinary days she wore thick flannel and patched skirts, boots stiff with cracked leather, and her hair, once artfully pinned, was now hacked blunt to her chin as though ceremony had been outlawed. That evening she moved through the cabin like a shadow, splitting kindling with dull hands, ladling water from the thaw barrel, keeping the fire going because routine was easier than meaning. The silence in the room wasn't new. It was aged. It had a smell, wood smoke, mothballs, damp wool, and resignation. But there was something strange in the air that night, a sense deep in her ribs that the quiet wasn't just emptiness, it was waiting. She spoke aloud to the snow sometimes, asked it why it hadn't finished what it started. Asked if it, like her, was lingering out of habit, but that night as dusk folded into darkness, something answered. It was a knock, soft at first, then louder, then 7 even raps, distinct, deliberate, like punctuation. Not pleading, not desperate, a kind of rhythm that belonged to a man who still believed in doors. Her hand hovered over the iron latch. No one knocked out here, not in years. The last knock had been a deputy searching for a runaway boy. She'd lied and sent him away with cornbread and a false trail. Evelyn drew in a breath and opened the door. They stood against the snow like sentinels, 7 men, tall, wrapped in worn furs and layered leather, snow dusting their shoulders. The firelight caught glints of bone jewelry, feathers, braids. Comanche, her mind whispered. Her heartbeat stumbled. The one in front stepped forward, pulling back his hood. His face was broad and strong, a scar running from the corner of his mouth to his chin like a memory carved in flesh. His eyes did not waver. "We seek shelter," he said. His voice was like low thunder, measured, old as rock, and oddly gentle. She glanced past him. None of them had weapons drawn, none of them moved. No menace. Just miles of weariness in their posture. Her hand on the door frame trembled slightly. Then she stepped aside. They entered without comment, shedding boots without being told. One knelt by the stove, hands out. Another crouched near the window, warming his shoulders. They brought silence with them, but not the suffocating kind. It was the kind that listens. Evelyn lit another lamp. Her hands shook as she dished out the last of the stew from the root cellar. The scarred one stepped forward, cupped the bowl with reverence. "Thanks," he said simply. She nodded. "Eat slow," she murmured. "There's no more after this." He gave a soft smile, almost unnoticeable, and did exactly as she asked. And so began the first night in 5 winters where Evelyn Grace Dawson wasn't entirely alone. The storm howled, but inside the cabin something stirred that hadn't stirred in a long time. Not warmth, not yet, but the space where warmth might begin. By morning, the wind had softened to a whisper. But the storm hadn't let go completely. Snow still pressed heavy against the windows, a thick white hush that covered everything. Evelyn woke early before the men stirred the embers in the stove, barely breathing. For a moment she wondered if it had all been a dream. 7 men like statues in the snow, the scarred one with the quiet eyes, the way silence had become something warmer, less cruel. But then she stepped from her bed and saw them, furs laid out in a half circle around the hearth, boots lined by the door without mud bowls rinsed and stacked neatly. These men had not invaded her space. They had respected it, entered like guests, not takers. Her eyes drifted toward the floor where he had slept. The one with the scar, he wasn't there. She opened the door, pulling her coat tight, and caught sight of him near the woodpile, Ronan 3 Feathers. Though he hadn't given his name yet, stood shirtless despite the cold steam curling off his skin as he split logs in a steady rhythm. His hair was tied back in a leather cord, black as coal, swinging with each stroke. The axe moved like part of him, controlled, precise. Not for show, not for pride, just work that needed doing. "You'll freeze out here," she called softly, voice cracking from disuse. He paused, turned only slightly. "Cold sharpens the edge," he replied, "and the man holding it." She didn't answer. There was nothing to argue. He wasn't wrong. Instead, she returned inside and stoked the fire. From the root cellar, she pulled the last of the carrots and a bit of salted meat. By the time the others stirred, the cabin smelled of something like a home smoke food. The faint sweetness of onions cooked down to sugar. The men rose without words, folding their furs with ritual-like care, one of them whispering a prayer into cupped hands before stepping outside to relieve himself. They waited at the table without needing to be told. Evelyn served them without comment. She didn't ask names and none were offered. It wasn't rudeness, it was respect. These men carried the kind of silence that didn't demand, only observed. Ronan sat apart from the others near the edge of the room, back to the wall, as if instinctively protecting her, or maybe simply watching. When she handed him his bowl, their fingers touched again, brief but steady. This time, neither of them pulled away. After breakfast, the others gathered their things, rolling their furs tight, adjusting cloaks, braiding fresh feathers into their hair. One man, older, with deep lines carved into his face and eyes like wet stone, touched her shoulder gently as he passed. A nod, a gesture of gratitude more honest than words. They left in silence, disappearing into the trees like smoke. Only Ronan remained. Evelyn didn't ask why. He didn't explain. Instead, he went back to the axe. That day passed without fanfare. He chopped wood until a neat stack rose beside the porch. She caught glimpses of him hauling fresh snow to melt, tending to the fire when it dipped too low, fixing the loose hinge on the barn door without being asked. It was as if he'd always lived in motion, always served through action, not conversation. And she, long unaccustomed to company, found herself adjusting to the rhythm of someone else's presence, without resistance. There were no questions between them, only gestures. He left a stone hawk on the windowsill, smoothed by hand, palm-sized, carved from something dark and weighty. She found it while folding blankets and held it in both hands like it might vanish. The shape was imperfect but intentional. A bird in mid-flight. She didn't know what it meant, not fully. But it felt like acknowledgement. That night she laid out the good quilts, the ones Sam's mother had sewn back when things still smelled of lemon soap and new beginnings. One over his shoulders after he'd fallen asleep near the stove, one folded by his feet. His breathing was steady. He didn't stir. But when she turned to go, his hand reached out and briefly curled around hers. Not a grasp, not a plea, just a small, solid touch, the kind that said, "I know you're real, and I am too." She stood there a long time before retreating to her bed, eyes wide open in the dark. The storm outside had quieted to a hush, the kind that falls when snowflakes float instead of fall. But inside her something was stirring that hadn't moved in years. Not longing, not yet, just recognition. Over the next days they fell into a rhythm. She boiled roots into tea. He brought in pine branches for kindling. He mended the fence line in the back without a word. She pressed herbs into a jar and left it by his tools. Their words were few, but their actions braided into something steady like fence posts sunk deep and tied with rawhide. She still didn't ask his name, and he still hadn't offered it. But that night, as she set a second bowl on the table beside her own and sat across from him for the first time, she said softly, "There's space in the loft, blankets too." He looked up, eyes shadowed by firelight. "We sleep on floors," he said. She didn't insist, but later when she climbed into her bed, she noticed he had placed the stone hawk on the nightstand beside the lamp. And that felt like answer enough. The storm didn't end all at once. It softened day by day as if winter itself were beginning to let go. Evelyn woke each morning wrapped in a little more warmth, not from fire alone, but from something else. Something shifting in the air between her and the man who remained. Ronan Three Feathers never explained why he stayed behind. He simply did. He worked like breath, constant, unnoticed unless it stopped. The kind of presence that neither demanded thanks nor offered explanation. Evelyn, for her part, never asked what had happened to make him so quiet. She sensed he wouldn't answer even if she did, and maybe that's why she began to trust him. They developed a rhythm neither had planned. She cooked, he gathered. She mended, he built. He carved fence rails from wind-fallen pines, stacking them by size without needing to be told. She noticed the way he watched the snow, always gauging its weight on the roof, the slant of it on the hill. The way his eyes scanned for signs, animal, man, danger. She hadn't realized how long she'd lived without someone looking after the land, or her. One morning she caught herself humming while stirring the stew pot and froze mid-note. The silence that followed wasn't shame but surprise. She hadn't heard her own voice in song since Sam died. Her cheeks flushed hot even in the cold kitchen. But when she glanced toward Ronan, who was whittling by the window, he didn't turn. He just kept carving, lips pressed together as if the tune had comforted him more than she'd ever guess. That afternoon he came in from the trees with a rabbit already skinned. He laid it on the table and said, "You were running low." She blinked. She hadn't told him that. He'd simply seen it, noticed the root cellar emptying the smaller portions. Her eyes met his across the table. "Thank you," she said. He nodded as if that was enough. Later, while the stew simmered, she placed 2 bowls on the table. Not in a straight line like hostess and guest, but across from one another, equal intentional. It was a quiet invitation, not an expectation. When he sat, he didn't speak, but he didn't hesitate either. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable but companionable, the way 2 people eat, when they've come to understand that presence is a kind of conversation. As the stew cooled, Ronan stood and wandered over to the hearth. Above it, a thin shelf held a few yellowed books Evelyn had stopped reading long ago. His fingers brushed their spines like he was searching for a memory. He pulled one down. Walden thumbed through its worn pages. "You read?" he asked, voice low. "Used to," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Still do," he replied. "You just forgot." She smiled without showing her teeth. That was the kind of thing she used to say, simple but edged with something sharp and kind. She didn't answer, but something softened behind her ribs. That night, as she twisted her hair back from her face, she tied it differently, half braid, half knot. It was nothing intentional, just instinct. But when she stepped out to check the stove, she caught Ronan watching her. His gaze wasn't intrusive, just thoughtful. "You braid your hair different now," he said. She reached up, almost startled, then shrugged. "It kept falling in my eyes." "You have reason now," he said, and that was all. His voice was so calm it barely made a ripple, but her stomach turned anyway, not from fear, but something far more dangerous, memory. The last time someone had looked at her and truly seen her had been years ago. And now this man, this stranger who slept near her hearth and worked without asking, was noticing things no one else had. The next morning she couldn't meet his eyes. She kept her hands busy scrubbing the wash basin harder than necessary, gathering kindling she didn't need, sweeping corners that had already been swept. He said nothing, didn't follow. But she saw him in glimpses outside, patching the chicken coop gate with strips of rawhide, checking the path to the creek, refastening the ropes that hung between the barn and porch to guide them during blizzards. When she came inside, later that evening, she found a bundle of jerky wrapped in muslin left on the table. No note, just the gift laid down like a bridge. She touched it once, then tucked it into the pantry. Still, she didn't say anything. 3 more days passed like that, him steady her uncertain. On the 4th, she slipped. She'd gone to the creek for water boots, crunching over packed snow breath, clouding the air. But beneath one drift, a slick patch of ice waited like a trap. Her foot skidded out. She fell hard, hips slamming the frozen ground. The bucket flew. Her breath left her. For a moment, she couldn't move. The world narrowed to cold sky and pain blooming up her side. She blinked, chest tight, unsure if she'd broken something or simply fractured a part of herself that had been too thin for too long. And then he was there. She didn't hear him coming. He appeared like the wind, crouched beside her, steadying her with hands warm and wide. "You fell," he murmured. She tried to nod, couldn't. Without asking, he lifted her gently, carefully, like she weighed nothing. But his touch wasn't about strength. It was about honor. His cheek brushed hers as he shifted her weight, his shoulder shielding her from the wind. Inside, he set her down by the fire and knelt to remove her boots, unwrap her shawl. Then he vanished. When he returned, he brought warm water, willow bark, and a look she couldn't decipher. He worked without speaking, crushing the herbs, pressing them to her bruised side. His fingers were rough but reverent, like he was tending something sacred. "You need rest," he said finally. "I'll take care of the rest." And he did. She watched from the rock, her breath shallow as he fed the chickens, swept the floor, and stirred the coals to life. He moved through her cabin not like a guest, but like a guardian. That night she didn't sleep. She just lay there, eyes open in the dark, one hand tucked beneath her pillow, and the other resting gently on the stone hawk still warm in her apron pocket. The thaw came quietly as it always did. Not in warmth, but in movement. Water dripping slowly from the eaves, snow slumping from the cabin roof like a tired animal settling in. The wind no longer howled, it whispered. Yet Evelyn Grace Dawson couldn't shake the feeling that something else had shifted, not in the weather, but in the woods. Ronan Three Feathers had grown more silent, more watchful. He rose earlier now, sometimes before the light broke across the tree line, moving with purpose, sharpening tools, inspecting prints near the barn. He never said what he was looking for, but Evelyn had lived too long in silence not to hear when it changed pitch. One morning she spotted the tracks herself, 3 sets of boot prints deep and purposeful, not wind-worn or lost. They came up from the creek, circled the barn, then disappeared into the pines. Not a pass-through, not aimless, intentional. She found Ronan by the fence line, coiling rope. They came close, she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I know," he replied. "They'll be back. No panic, just fact." His blade was visible now, hanging from his belt like it belonged there, not as threat, but readiness. That night he moved his sleeping furs closer to the door. He didn't say why, and she didn't ask. But she noticed the way he listened, how he froze mid-motion at the crack of a branch, how he kept the fire low so the light didn't spill too far outside. Evelyn stayed busy pretending normalcy. She added cloves to the stew, stitched a tear in her best skirt. But her hands trembled when she wasn't careful. It wasn't just the cold. It was memory resurfacing like ice breaking beneath your feet. She'd known this kind of danger before when men stopped seeing her as human and started seeing her as property. It had been years since anyone had tried to take anything from her. But that was only because she'd made herself too alone to touch. Now with Ronan here, she wasn't invisible anymore, and that was both comfort and risk. 2 days passed. Then came the riders. Midday, just as she was pouring water into the wash basin, the sound came, hooves crunching snow with the slow rhythm of men who'd already made up their minds. Ronan was already outside. She stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. It felt foreign in her grip, the wood worn smooth from years of disuse. Her breath came in short clouds. The sky had turned slate gray, heavy with something that wasn't quite snow. 3 men emerged from the woods, mounted eyes squinting in the light. Evelyn recognized the first instantly. Wayland Cutter, all broad shoulders and swagger. The kind of man who thought territory came with ownership. Beside him was Jed Pike, wiry and pale with a lip that had never healed right. The third was a boy, really Micah, lorn, red-cheeked and twitchy, trying to look older than he was. They stopped a dozen paces from the cabin. Wayland dismounted, grinning like a fox who'd found the henhouse unlocked. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this something, little widow Dawson playing hearth and home with a Comanche?" Ronan didn't move. He stood near the barn, arms crossed the wind, tugging at the hem of his coat. Jed laughed under his breath. "Heard you'd gone soft, Evelyn. Didn't think you'd go savage, though." Evelyn lifted the rifle, not aimed, but raised. "You're not welcome here," she said. Wayland's grin widened. "Oh, I think we are. This land's still white land. You letting a red man into your bed makes folks uneasy." "He's not in my bed," she snapped, then regretted it. Not for modesty, for dignity. The truth was no one's business but hers. Ronan didn't flinch. His stillness was sharper than steel. Micah shifted fingers, twitching on the butt of his shotgun. He looked nervous, like a match too close to a dry pine. "We just want a word," Wayland said. "Just a little talk." "One step closer," Ronan said, finally speaking. "And you'll have more than words." His voice was deep and clear, not loud but final. The air shifted. Micah stepped forward. Everything happened at once. The boy raised his gun and Evelyn screamed, sharp and instinctual, the sound of something sacred being threatened. Ronan moved like lightning carved into flesh. He crossed the snow in 3 strides and slammed his shoulder into Micah's chest, knocking him backward. The gun went flying. Wayland reached for his revolver. Evelyn fired. The shot missed, whistling past his ear and cracking the bark of a pine. Jed lunged at Ronan with a knife, but Ronan was already turning. His blade met Jed's in a flash of steel and fury. One cut, clean. Jed collapsed, clutching his thigh, blood staining the snow. Wayland froze. His courage collapsed into his boots. "Go," Ronan said. Wayland looked from Jed to Micah, still gasping in the drift. He didn't speak, just turned and walked away, left the others behind. Ronan stood still until the woods swallowed him. Evelyn stood on the porch, the rifle shaking in her hands, breath catching like a sob she hadn't earned. "They came," she whispered. Ronan walked to her, blood not his own on his hands. "I'm not ashamed," she said, looking at him. "Of you." Of this he didn't reply at first. Then he said quietly, "I would have died for you." She stepped forward, touched his wrist. "You lived for me." He lowered his forehead to hers, not as possession, not as promise, but as something unbreakable. Later they tied Jed and Micah to their horses and pointed them down the trail with bruises and warnings. No one spoke for hours. The snow fell again, softer this time. But the wind had changed. It no longer mourned. It watched. The morning after the men rode off, the world felt different. Not safer exactly, but stripped clean, as though the storm of weather of violence had burned something out of the air and left behind only truth. Evelyn stood at the edge of the porch, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, the rifle now leaning forgotten against the doorframe. The snow glistened in soft heaps where the scuffle had disturbed it. But there was no more shouting, no more boots crunching where they didn't belong. Inside, Ronan Three Feathers was already tending the fire. His movements were slow, deliberate. There was no rush now, but no ease either. She watched him from the threshold for a moment before stepping back in. Neither of them spoke much that day. They moved like two people who had seen a fire rage through their world and now stood staring at the embers, asking silently what comes next. By noon, Ronan was outside stacking new wood, each log lined up as if order itself was a form of protection. Evelyn boiled broth from the last bones and hung fresh herbs near the stove. She swept the floor twice, though it was already clean. It wasn't about dust. It was about space, making room for something she hadn't let in for years. Later that afternoon, she stepped out with a basket of eggs and found him by the barn, repairing a split beam with quiet precision. His back was to her, but he must have heard her approach. Without turning, he said, "We'll need to reset the south fence." Storm pulled half the posts loose. She stopped beside him, careful not to step too close. He finally turned to her then. His eyes, clear gray, steady as stone, held hers. "Unless you'd rather I go." The silence stretched for a moment. Evelyn looked down at her hands, red from cold, clutching the basket too tightly. "You didn't leave before," she said. "After the fight, after the blood, I didn't plan to." He said, "Not unless you asked." She shook her head. "I didn't want you to stay because I was afraid. I want you to stay because I'm not." That evening she made stew, not out of necessity but out of care. She added dried apples for sweetness and a pinch of the rosemary she'd kept hidden in a jar marked for spring. When she handed him his bowl, he met her eyes with a quiet nod, then said, "You saved something for this." "I did," she said, "and I didn't even know why. Until now." After supper, he pulled a bundle from beside the hearth and unfolded it, a fur blanket lined with geometric stitching. "You can have the loft tonight," she said, reaching for a candle. But Ronan shook his head. "I'll stay near the fire." Her hand stilled. She swallowed. "You always stay near the fire." He nodded, but there was something in his expression, softness, not hesitation. As if he was giving her space to choose. Evelyn lit the candle anyway and climbed the loft slowly. Halfway up, she stopped, turned. He was looking up at her, waiting. "Will you keep it burning?" she asked, voice low. He nodded. Always. That night she slept without fear. Not because danger had vanished, but because she no longer bore its weight alone. In the days that followed, they worked side by side. Ronan hauled the fence posts, reset the corners of the barn, tied fresh leather at the hinges. Evelyn organized the pantry, rewrote labels, braided garlic, stitched new liners for the windows. Together they brought shape to the cabin, not just as a place to survive, but to live. One morning she found her old mirror tucked beneath a stack of blankets in the trunk. Dust covered the glass. She wiped it clean slowly. The reflection that stared back at her was someone she didn't quite recognize but didn't want to hide from. Her cheeks had color again. Her hair, though still wild, was neatly tied in a braid Ronan had once noticed. She touched it, remembering the way he'd said, "You have reason now." In the afternoon, she put on her burgundy scarf, the one she hadn't worn since the funeral. It wasn't about vanity, it was about memory. about reclaiming the part of her that hadn't died with Sam. When she stepped outside, Ronan was repairing the rope line between the house and the barn. He paused, looked at her. He didn't compliment her, he didn't need to. The way his gaze softened was enough. That evening he carved a second hawk, this one smaller, with wings half spread as if just beginning to take off. He set it beside the first on the shelf without a word. Evelyn saw it and said nothing, but later she added a pine sprig beside them. Small altar, quiet promise. That night, as she stirred cider on the stove, the last of it, she asked, "Why did you stay?" He was sitting cross-legged near the fire, mending the strap on his belt. He didn't look up. "Because you didn't ask me to leave." The words settled into the room like a hymn. The next morning, Evelyn rose before dawn and found fresh snow on the ground, thin light no longer heavy, and boot prints, not Ronan's, 3 new sets. They came up to the barn and circled back into the woods. When she found him by the creek, his blade already strapped to his hip, he said simply, "They know I'm still here. Will they come back?" "They're not finished," he replied, "but neither are we." She looked at him, then back at the cabin, the fire still flickering behind frosted panes, the rows of chopped wood stacked high. This was no longer a shelter. It was a home. "Then we prepare," she said. "We stand," he agreed. And in the echo of their shared stillness, Evelyn felt something more powerful than hope stir beneath her ribs. Not survival, belonging. The snow didn't fall that night. It hovered like breath held in the sky, waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn sat by the window with the rifle in her lap, not because she believed it would save her, but because old ghosts had long memories. Ronan sat on the floor near the door, back straight, eyes open. The knife in his hand wasn't drawn, just resting in his palm, as if even steel needed to stay quiet for now. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Outside, nothing moved, but Evelyn could feel it. The presence of men who believed that a woman couldn't choose love unless it was given to her. That a man like Ronan couldn't be anything but threat or shame. But they were wrong, and Evelyn was done being quiet for the comfort of cowards. At some point in the long dark, Ronan shifted his weight and said softly, "They won't come tonight." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because the kind of men who carry hate like theirs, they like an audience. They'll wait for light." She nodded. It made sense. So much of violence was about being seen. Morning broke slow and gray. The sky was low, the kind of color that made everything feel closer. She stepped onto the porch shawl wrapped firm around her shoulders and scanned the tree line. Nothing yet. But they were coming. She knew it like she knew the shape of her own name. She found Ronan near the woodpile, sharpening a new post for the fence. His movements were steady, like no storm could touch him. She approached slowly. "I was scared once," she said, "scared of being alone. Then I got used to it, started believing maybe I deserved it." He looked at her blade, paused mid-motion. "You didn't. I know that now," she said. Then quieter, "Because of you." Ronan lowered the knife. "I didn't fix you, Evelyn." "No," she said, "but you stayed long enough for me to remember I wasn't broken." He didn't smile, but something softened in the line of his shoulders. By mid-afternoon, they had stacked wood inside the cabin, locked the barn, tied the animals close. Evelyn placed 3 candles in the windows, not as a welcome but a warning. "We'll be ready," Ronan said. Evelyn glanced at the rifle propped by the hearth, then at the carved hawks resting above the mantel. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. He stepped closer, not touching her, just near enough to let her feel it, the heat of presence, the strength of quiet resolve. "If they come," he said, "they'll find we don't scare easy." That night she braided her hair carefully, not for beauty, for steadiness. Each twist of hair was a memory made firm, Sam's laugh her baby's weight against her chest the first time she heard Ronan say her name like it mattered. She tied the braid with a piece of red thread. After supper, they sat close by the fire, not speaking, just listening to it crackle to the wind shifting outside, to the sound of two hearts choosing the same path. When she stood to head to the loft, she paused beside him. "You don't have to guard the door tonight." "I'm not guarding the door," he said. "I'm watching over the place that gave me fire again." Her throat tightened. She reached out, touched his shoulder, and left her hand there just long enough for the moment to breathe. He didn't move. He didn't need to. When she reached the top of the ladder, she looked down and saw him still sitting there, back to the hearth, following the dark. But this time she didn't feel like he was holding back the world. She felt like he was inviting it to try. And suddenly the silence no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like home. In the coldest parts of life, we often build walls not to keep others out, but to survive the silence. Evelyn Grace Dawson believed the world had ended long before the snow fell. She believed her story had closed, that love and dignity were luxuries meant for other people in other seasons. But sometimes redemption arrives quietly. Not with fireworks, but with footsteps in the snow. Not with declarations, but with someone who stays, Ronan 3. Feathers didn't rescue her with words. He didn't try to fix what grief had broken. He simply stayed long enough to remind her that she was still here, still worthy, still capable of choosing warmth over fear. This story isn't about romantic grand gestures. It's about the sacred bravery of continuing. Of rebuilding fences even when you're not sure what's on the other side. Of letting someone into your silence and trusting they won't run from the echoes. In a world so loud with judgment, stories like Evelyn's remind us that gentleness is strength, that love is often quiet, and that survival is not the same as living. Sometimes the most powerful words are not, "I love you," but, "You don't have to be alone anymore." If this story stirred something in you, if you saw yourself in the scents, the snowfall, or the quiet strength of love earned, we invite you to join us here at Frontier Reverie. Subscribe for more cinematic Western stories full of redemption, resilience, and raw human truth. Share this video if you believe stories like Evelyn's and Ronan's deserve to be remembered, not for how loud they shout, but for how deeply they heal. Because some hearts don't need saving, they just need someone who stays.